in Montreal, Quebec. Just on my way back home from Jean-Martin Fortier's farm, Les Farms des Quatre Temps. And I stopped over here in Montreal to take a look at the city, reflect. I'm in my old neighborhood that I used to live in, the Mile End, back in my musician hipster days. And I want to talk to you guys today about 5 things that I think are really important to consider if you're going to farm in a high density urban area like Montreal. I'm at a fairly typical urban lot here, just around the corner from where we started, and this is a lot that would be a very, I wouldn't say typical, but more common type of lot that people might spec out if they were going to farm something in the city. So these kind of lots are usually owned by the city, and so there's a number of things here to consider when you're looking to farm a site like this in a city like Montreal. And so there's a handful of things here. So the first thing is, right off the bat I'll start with, is if the lot is owned by the city, then you've got all kinds of red tape and bureaucracy that you might have to deal with. And if that's the case, it might take a long time for a project like this to get off the ground. Okay, so that's the first thing. That's usually the first barrier to entry for many people. So this is often why you see non-profits or non-governmental organizations getting involved in urban agriculture projects like this, because the average person, if they're just an entrepreneur who wants to farm, looks at this and says, it's too much red tape, it's too much time, it's gonna be such a hassle and cost, which there's other costs I'll talk about in a second, to get involved with. So for-profit enterprises, in most cases, don't get involved in farming areas like this. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's super, super important is that urban lots like this often have soil contamination. And so that is a huge red flag. And it's not to say that a site like this can't be farmed. It certainly can be, but if you have to deal with soil contamination, you have a whole list of things that you have to do and costs that you have to incur in order to make this soil farmable. So often on urban sites like this, you've got some kind of heavy metal contamination, whether it be lead, mercury, or any off chemical that came from maybe this was a gas station at one point, maybe it was a factory, who knows what was here. And the older the city, often the more things there are to look into. So there's a whole can of worms that you get into on that. And if you're going to go forward with a site like this and use it for farming, and you need to remediate the soil, you're looking at a lot of cost, because like you can't just rototill this site up and farm it. It doesn't work that way. You're going to make people sick, and it's not going to be a sustainable business endeavor for you. So most urban farms that are farming in cities like this, they need to build up. So often what that looks like, perhaps in the case of Will Allen's farming, or those of you who are familiar with Soul Food Farms in Vancouver, they create raised beds and they're just building on usually a hardscape, like a parking lot or something like that, and they're just bringing in all new soil. Brooklyn Grange, rooftop urban farm in New York City, farming on a hardscape on a roof, brought up a lightweight composite soil that goes on top of the roof with a membrane underneath it. So getting into that creates a whole new arena of cost. Like, this is a very expensive endeavor. You know, one thing that's highly advantageous about farming in just regular good soil, even if you have to build that soil up like I do, is that you've got the subsoil beneath your topsoil. And I am not a microbiologist or soil biologist by any means, but I can tell you from my own experience in farming and just working in soil for as many years as I have, is that there is a relationship between the topsoil and the subsoil. There are things that happen in that between those layers, whether it's cycling nitrogen, oxygen, or where the worms go deep in the winter and they come back up in the summer. There is a real relationship between those layers of subsoil. And when you build up and you've only got, 8 inches to 18 inches of soil that you can use, there are going to be definitive differences in how your crops perform in that soil. And so that might mean that you can't grow certain crops, particularly ones that need deep tap roots and need that kind of relationship. Having said that, I've seen many urban farms all over the world growing in relatively shallow soil and growing all kinds of stuff. So it's definitely possible, but it's something to consider. And a site like this site looks like altogether it's about, might be 1/3 of an acre. To bring in all new soil to a site like this is going to cost you at least $80,000. I've looked at urban farms that are anywhere between 1/4 acre to 2 acres, and the costs can go anywhere between $50,000 to $250,000 and or even beyond. So to bring in all new soil, whether you're building raised beds or you're going to scrape off a layer of soil here and then put down a new layer of soil and maybe hill up some raised beds, you're looking at a lot of cost. And so that is a serious consideration. The other consideration that you have when you're farming in a city is shade structures. So when you're in a high density city like this, even though in this immediate spot I'm at isn't necessarily high density, but if you just look down Clark Avenue here, we've got high density. Building to building, there's very few yards and whatnot, is that you've got to consider where the light goes. You've got shade structures, so I've got Van Horn Boulevard right behind me here. Fortunately, in this case of this specific plot, the south is this way, so we've actually got good aspect here. But in most cities, when you've got tall buildings around you, those are going to cast shadows, and so there is a potential disadvantage there with how you get light. And again, that's not so much the case in this one. The other thing that you really have to consider is theft, vandalism, and people just cutting through the plot. Because cities have so many people, I mean, Montreal's got, I think, around 4 million people in it, so it's relatively high density. There's rarely a time you could be at this place any day of the year where you don't look around and see a lot of people and traffic around all the time. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be prone to theft and vandalism. It just means that you have greater chance of it because there's all kinds of people around at all times of the day. So who knows what you can have. And so what that means is that you're going to have to invest more in fencing. And in this case here, we actually have nice steel fencing all around it except for parts of it. And so if you were to be using this site to farm, you would have to invest a considerable amount of time and money into fencing to keep people from just cutting through, people from walking their dogs, and going to the bathroom on your crops. So these are major considerations. The other one that you have to consider, and it's certainly not as important as the others, is just a lack of privacy, a lot of city noise around you. Farming in a city is certainly a different experience than farming in the countryside, like I was just at Jean Martin's farm in Hemingford, and when everything stops at the end of the day, everything's quiet. Well, that's not the case here, and so this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that can affect your workflow. It can affect your productivity because many of you guys who follow my stuff, you know that when I'm out in some of my sites that are front yards, I get a lot of people that coming by, and so this can be a good thing or a bad thing. Often for us, it's a good thing because people see what we're doing and they go, "Oh, that's really cool." But I don't live in a high density city like Montreal. I'm in a low density city and low density urban, right? And this is high density urban, and all that traffic and noise and people constantly can really disrupt your workflow. So that's something to consider there. So I know that I just kind of laid out 5 things that sound somewhat negative, and I'm not here to discourage people from farming in cities. In fact, it's the opposite, but I want to give you a realistic idea of what you should expect. So having said all of that, I want to talk about some positive things. So one thing right off the bat that's incredibly positive about farming in a city, especially a place like this, we're at a park where there's lots of kids playing, is that you are going to have a really good positive social effect on people around here, in the sense that they're going to come by and these kids are going to see you pulling carrots out of the ground, they're going to see you harvesting lettuce. You're going to engage people in food. And I think ultimately that's a really good thing. And there is I think there's a high social impact there, is just like showing people a farm, engaging them in it, but there's also a huge element of education in that. And I can speak to this from my own personal experience, is that when I'm farming in some of my areas that are more visible, people come by, they ask questions. Not only do they become customers, but they become better gardeners themselves, or it even just perks their interest in gardening, and then they get started in farming. So for myself, you know, my whole mission with what I do, is to disseminate this information to more people so that more people can empower themselves to start growing food. That's kind of my mission with this. And I think an urban farm site like this, many others across the world, they have that potential. So something that is that you can consider, that's, I don't know if it's neither good nor bad. Here's an opinion of mine on the whole thing, and I've definitely changed where I stand with bringing food to people, urban farming, since I've started this. Is that a lot of people go, they'll say, and again, I don't want to offend people here, I just want to give you guys, I want to share my experience with you and help you make better decisions. You might say, Curtis, you don't know what the hell you're talking about, and that's totally fine. But here's my thoughts on it. A lot of people assume that with urban farms, one, that you can farm in a city here and you're going to considerably reduce your environmental impact, in the sense that, okay, food is grown here, so it's closer to where people are, thereby I'm reducing the amount of food miles that are consumed to get that food to a person's plate. And there is some truth to that, but there's also a lot of misunderstanding with that, and here's why. The first reason is, in order to set this farm up, it requires an incredible amount of inputs and infrastructure and capital. And when you look at all those costs, so like I can't break those costs all down from you by just off the top of my head, but if you think about the resources it takes to bring the soil here, the machinery it'll take to shape this ground, the infrastructure to put in fencing, remediate the soil, all that kind of stuff, it is a lot of time, money, and infrastructure. And when you look at that and you offset it from the sales you might make to people across the street here to buy salad mix once a week or something like that, I would gamble that the savings in energy that you make is totally negligible. And I'm not saying that because I want to be negative. I'm a very optimistic person, and I really believe urban farming can help change the world. But again, I just want to give you guys a realistic perspective. At least understand my perspective, and if I'm wrong, prove me wrong and tell me where I'm wrong. But I really believe that we shouldn't be naive about what we can actually accomplish through having unrealistic expectations. And I think that is one of them. So that's one that's very common in urban farming, and I must admit that when I first got into this, I thought that we could stop global warming by farming in cities, and I can tell you right now that I no longer believe that. Just based on what I know is needed to get done to make this site farmable. It's a lot of resources, okay? The second thing is, a lot of people have this idea that if you're going to farm in a place like this, let's say this is a underprivileged community, and you really believe and feel that the people that live in this area don't have access to good food. Perhaps it's a food desert, you know, like in cases with Will Allen in Milwaukee, places in Detroit. And I don't want to discredit those operations, because I think those people are doing great and wonderful things. But again, I'm just giving you my perspective on my experience traveling around the world and meeting farmers all over, particularly urban farmers, is that people often have this idea that they're really going to save a neighborhood by coming and bringing good food to that neighborhood. And that's a really good intention, and the motives there are incredibly just, and I totally share them. But the reality is, and again, how do I say this without sounding too harsh? Maybe I should just be honest and just say it, is that often the people that you think should be a certain way and eat certain food and follow the values that you follow, don't give a shit about your values. They don't care about salad mix, organic or organic vegetables, and you know, I could speculate on all the reasons why that is, but I don't need to. I don't want to maybe create a false narrative of why certain people don't like certain things. All I can tell you is that from my experience in underprivileged inner city areas, it's not necessarily the priority of those people living there to make sure they're eating organic salad mix and vegetables every day. And what often happens is that people create these farms or these businesses based on that idea, and then they're often disappointed because they find that their clientele are still people that are wealthy and really value what they're doing, and they're often disappointed because they find that the people in the community that they're in, that live there, don't really care that much. And again, I'm not saying this because I want to convey some kind of narrative. I'm just conveying this because this is what I've seen over and over again. And it's not that I've seen it every time. There's certainly been farms I've seen where they have gone in and it's really been adopted by the community. But I can tell you that I've visited a lot of farms over the last 7 years, and most of them, by a pretty big order of magnitude, don't achieve that social goal. And again, I'm not trying to say don't do that, but I just want to give you guys a dose of reality and perhaps share my experiences with you. Again, tell me if I'm totally off base. Tell me if I'm wrong. Leave your questions and comments below. Please subscribe to this channel if you want to see more stuff like this. Like and share these videos with your friends. And check out my website, theurbanfarmer.co, where you've got my online course, my book, my one-day workshop. And if you want to make a donation to the show, you're always welcome to do that, and it's very much appreciated. You can do that quickly at theurbanfarmer.co/support. All right, guys, thanks for watching.